We have a wonderful opportunity today to hear from two devoted conservation leaders in our field who wrote a book that many of you have read in this room, and if you haven't, we'll have it for sale in the back. John Jarvis, who is the former National Park Service chief, and his chief scientist, Gary Machlis, are here with us today. And Brian Forrest will be introducing you to both of them in a moment. But I would like to say, for the Natural Areas Association members who are sitting in the audience today, it is a true honor, in my opinion, to have these two gentlemen with us. For this is the end of a tremendous week, an incredibly successful conference, and I hope you're feeling as energized as we are. These two gentlemen are going to speak to you today about the importance of science in the work that we do, the importance of empathy in the work that we do, and I think John is a great example of somebody who had in his care and in his power the health of our national park system for several years of his life. And he saw the value, as the visionary that he is, he saw the value in having a scientist by his side to help him make the decisions that he made on a regular basis for how our national parks would be best cared for and how the resources, the special biological resources in those parks would be cared for. And I think it stands as a wonderful model and metaphor for what we have experienced here this week and promoted here this week, which is science and practice that go hand in hand and need to go hand in hand. So, without further ado, I am going to introduce Brian, who will introduce more formally John and Gary, but I would like to just say one more thing. We have books for sale in the back, and we would like to invite you all to a celebration cocktail hour in the back of the room when Gary and John are done. So thank you very much.
Well, welcome everybody to the 2018 Carlson Lecture. It's a lecture that the Department of Recreation, Park, and Tourism Studies hosts generally every year, and named for a former chair of our department and professor. And technically, the lecture deals with some aspect of the outdoors, outdoor recreation, and all of the associated concepts, issues, concerns around the out-of-doors or the heritage that we share. And one of the great things, when you read the book by Dr. Machlis and Director Jarvis, one of the things they talk about is kind of that mushy line between humans and nature, and that culture and nature are no longer separate silos. So it's a great thing that the outdoors addresses all of the things that we're interested in. Let me just tell you a little bit about these fine gentlemen that are going to be speaking. I say Director Jarvis because I had the pleasure of working for him as one of his 20,000 employees in the National Park Service. I most recently was working in 4 parks under his leadership, and I can't get beyond calling him Director Jarvis, but he was the 40th, he's the 18th director of the National Park Service, and he rose to that level after 40 years in the profession, starting as an interpretive ranger on the National Mall during the bicentennial in 1976. Has worked in 9 parks, been regional director, and then became the director under President Barack Obama and served in that capacity through that entire 8-year administration. I said that I had the pleasure of working for Director Jarvis, and I felt like I arrived when his mustache began following me on the Twitter. The other speaker is Dr. Gary Machlis, who is currently a university professor of environmental sustainability at Clemson University. Before that, he was a professor at the University of Idaho, has a PhD from Yale University, and an interesting degree. It's in both sociology and ecology, because those were the 2 sort of burning concerns that in order to manage places, you also have to manage people and understand them. Gary Machlis also has served as the visiting chief social scientist of the National Park Service, and it was in that role that I had the chance to work for him as well. I was in a graduate program, and I took a summer internship And 6 years later, and no degree later, I left a position with the social science program in the National Park Service. But I know that in this audience today we have seasoned professionals, we have members of the public, and we have students. And I think for any of you, if you have a chance to take an internship that lasts 6 years and develops a collegial relationship, a mentor relationship, and a friendship that now almost 20 years later, I'm able to celebrate today, you're doing something very right. So it's with great pleasure that we're going to present Dr. Gary Machlis and Director John Jarvis, and I believe Gary's going to talk first. So welcome these folks.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thanks to all of you for joining us today for an important conversation about the future of conservation in America. We are both honored to be here at Indiana University and give the Carlson Lecture, and able to participate in the Natural Areas Association 2018 conference. We would like to congratulate the association for its 44-year history, though humility reminds us all that Keith Richards has been playing lead guitar for the Rolling Stones 12 years more than your organization has existed. The NAA has played a critical role in conservation, a bridge between the local small-scale and large landscape conservation at the state and national level. And your membership, from local land managers to land trust staff and volunteers, policy experts, students, teachers, and interested citizens, that reflects what is best about civic engagement in this country. Today we want to speak briefly on the future of conservation in America. These thoughts closely follow the book released this spring, The Future of Conservation in America, a chart for rough water. For reasons that will soon become obvious, the ideas and views presented here are ours alone. They do not reflect Clemson University, the University of California, Berkeley, Indiana University, the Natural Areas Association, United Airlines, which flew us here, or anyone else. They are ours alone, but they emerge from 40 years apiece of experience, still less than Keith Richards' gig with the Stones, in conservation politics. We wrote The Future of Conservation for several reasons. We wanted to sound the alarm over the current assault by the Trump administration on conservation. We wanted to use the lessons that we learned to describe how this turbulent time for conservation, what we call rough water, is impacting the American landscape and how it may unfold beyond this one administration. We also wrote to provide practical strategies for action. It is not enough to be outraged or to recite a litany of environmental harm being done by the present administration. There are essential and effective strategies that can advance the cause of conservation in America in ways that are bipartisan, respectful of differences, science-informed, forward-looking, and practical. And we share these strategies in order to encourage their use. Finally, we wrote to declare our confidence in the resilience of American institutions, in the American conservation movement, and its contribution to the nation. If you are a conservationist, you are engaged in patriotic acts. For life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness includes clean air and clean water. And hence, you are patriots, and we applaud you. So our book charts a path from alarm to action to optimism. We want to very briefly share with you all three elements and then engage in a necessary and hopefully lively conversation with you and the audience here. There's microphones for questions. Brian will be moderating, and we look forward. First, the alarm. The immediate assault on conservation is wide-ranging, and it includes abandoning the Paris Accord on climate change, which every country in the world except the US has joined now that North Korea and Syria got their act together. Eliminating citizen advisory groups and removing university faculty from other advisory groups because they received funding for university research while stacking these groups with industry officials. Removing public access to scientific data and erasing important websites for citizens to gain information about environmental concerns, attempting to muzzle federal scientists, violating scientific integrity policies, and retaliating against those civil service professionals that resist. Proposing the elimination of successful conservation collaborations that have engaged successfully industry and environmentalists, such as the Chesapeake Bay and the Great Lakes initiatives. Rescinding resource management policies that protect national parks, and working to reduce the size of national monuments created by both Republican and Democratic administrations. Rolling back regulations that protect citizens and arm them with information, such as eliminating the requirement that fracking operations reveal the chemicals, some carcinogenic, used in underground pressurization that has demonstrably caused harm. Cutting funding for vital climate change research, proposing that accident-prone offshore deepwater drilling be expanded, while at the same time proposing to lower the already low royalty payments by oil companies that are used to support local conservation through the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which has been in place since 1964. Weakening as a prelude to gutting the core federal conservation laws, such as the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and more. These actions directly harm conservation and degrade the protection of the nation's lands, waters, and communities, and the families dependent upon them. And there is more to come. The populist movement, with its resentment of scientific experts, media, minorities, immigrants, and the federal government, will likely extend beyond this current administration. Conservation groups and university scientists and institutions like the Indiana University and the Natural Areas Association will continue to be included in this collection of resented interests. The politics of personal destruction, the viciousness of the alt-right that even now attacks conservatives as well as conservationists, the turning away from building resilience into the fabric of American cities and the countryside, and the erosion of American preeminence in science will all likely continue. In addition, the challenges facing conservation are even more structural and long-term. In the book, we note, regardless of political party, narrow self-interest, or even well-intentioned actions, there are major environmental and social threats which confront America. They form the underlying causes that frame our immediate conservation problems. 3 of these threats can serve as interdependent examples: climate change, species extinction, and economic inequality. There is, for example, a direct line between climate change and economic disadvantage in this country, with poorer counties and poorer neighborhoods confronting more hazardous futures than wealthy ones. Coastal cities are the vanguard of harm. The immensity of impact of Hurricane Florence introduced to the American vocabulary new numbers never heard before. 18 trillion gallons of rain from one storm. That is enough to cover Indiana's 36,418 square miles in 2.5 feet of water. One storm. This is a statistic Behind it is human suffering. In the absence of preventative action by 2035, nearly 170 coastal communities will reach what's called chronic inundation, flooding on average every other week. These communities will face profound decisions and hard alternatives of defending against the sea, accommodating rising water, or retreating from flood-prone areas. If we are one country, then the Great Flood of 1913 that struck Indiana and the Midwest and left 250,000 people homeless and led to the growth of the American Red Cross is part of our collective history, and Hurricane Maria and its devastation of Puerto Rico is all our responsibility, and our lack of sufficient response all our shame. For conservation to navigate these rough waters, there is a need to have both the immediate and the long view, to respond to the current threats and the underlying causes. An act that we describe as strategic intention, which is simply a fancy way of saying act, but act smart. Strategic intention means that for an action for conservation is not just useful in its own right, starting an urban gardening program, or protecting a wetland, or electing a conservationist to city office, but it's an act that leads to further advances. We describe in the book this important principle and provide examples. Importantly, we suggest a very different understanding of what conservation means and what it can accomplish. Our experience suggests that the conservation movement must greatly expand its base, and we call for a unified vision that binds nature protection, historical preservation, business sustainability, public health, civil rights and social justice, and science into common cause. We applaud Indiana University for its vision of placing the Department of Parks, Recreation, and Tourism in the School of Public Health, for it is our firm belief that parks, recreation, and tourism have much to contribute to public health. You are ahead of the curve. Stay there. This is not the siloed conservation of the recent past. Too often, portions of the conservation movement struggle amongst themselves for priority, funding, membership, and more. We quote Ben Franklin and remind conservationists they must either hang together or they will surely hang separately. We write, there will come a time when the physician, the pastor, the park ranger, the business leader, the scientist, and the school teacher, all working together for conservation, will seem not unusual, but expected. This is of critical strategic importance and suggests that new and broader alliances for conservation are necessary, and which will require the giving up of turf and territory. When civil rights and social justice and nature conservation and historic preservation and health and sustainability and science all join together, real progress is possible. Now I'd like to turn it over to John.
Thank you, Gary. Got us all nice and depressed. So now my job is to give you hope and a strategy. Thank you, Brian, Lisa, and all the students we met with earlier today, and the Natural Areas Association attendees as well. Thank you for being here. You know, every time Gary and I have done this talk, probably 20 times now, and every time he says that line, the physician, the pastor, the park ranger, the business leader, the scientist, and the school teacher, I imagine them walking into a bar. I haven't come up with the punchline yet, though, so that's one of your assignments. It's really great to be in a room with folks that really care about conservation, they care about nature, they care about science, and all of you work in some role in stewardship of these places. I now live in California. I retired from the Park Service, and we're in a little political season, if you hadn't noticed. And recently I was at an event where there was a large crowd of park professionals, and one of the folks that's running for governor of California is the current Lieutenant Governor, Gavin Newsom. And he was addressing a crowd of professionals in the park world. And he was using a metaphor to kind of make his point. And the metaphor was that there had been this eruption of wildflowers in Death Valley after an unusually wet spring. And he said, no one knew this was going to happen, that these seeds had laid dormant, and then the spring rains came and this eruption of flowers. And he kept saying, no one knew. Well, I was up to speak next, and I couldn't quite pass up that opportunity to say, Lieutenant Governor, we knew, because we're park professionals and we know stuff. To say that no one knew is not really the case. And so Gary and I know stuff, like all of you, and that's why we wrote this book. These are challenging times for science and for nature. And to navigate these rough waters as we articulate that, we need, as Gary said, both a long view and an immediate set of actions. And we need to respond to those underlying causes with strategic intention. This was a principle that we applied to the centennial of the National Park Service. It was an opportunity to celebrate 100 years of conservation in our U.S. national parks, but we wanted to do more than that. We wanted to use it in a strategic way to create the next generation of park visitors, of advocates and supporters, and we specifically targeted the millennial generation, the 18 to 35-year-old, that are the largest cohort in American history and will inherit this responsibility as well as all the challenges out there as well. And as a result, frankly, we've seen some pretty strong resistance out there to the attack on our national parks and on conservation, and that was one of our strategic intentions, is to build that kind of resistance movement. Now, it also resulted in a lot of visitors coming to our parks. Some might suggest that we're a little bit overwhelmed by visitors, but let's say I'll take that over apathy or indifference any day. We outlined 14 specific strategies in our book for the future of conservation, things that can be done to really address this. And we're not suggesting they're all original. Some are being done by some conservation groups in some places and at some times, but we suggest that they could be more broadly and more systematically applied across the country. For instance, and I'm not going to go through all 14, but I will mention a couple of key ones. One is really about, frankly, the communication of science to the American people. It continues to be quite dismaying how little the American public really understand about science and the scientific method and what science really means in terms of their lives. I work at the University of California, Berkeley now, and I recently was advising some undergrad students in science, all of them ultimately working towards PhDs, to take a class in poetry along the way, or in journalism, so that they can learn to write and speak to the public in a way that the public can be moved by it. We also suggest that conservation communication must come from a much broader coalition than just scientists or just park rangers, but also from teachers, from popular writers, from filmmakers. We met a young student that's a filmmaker here, from corporate executives and mayors and from governors and religious leaders. All need to speak up because they all have a stake in the future of the planet. We also must learn as a community to work more effectively at the local level in conservation efforts, building understanding, cooperation, empathy for the challenges that they are facing, and trust, particularly in rural America, which is often skipped over when we think about the big conservation needs. We cite a particular example in our book by the son of Burt's Bees founders. Burt's Bees founder was Roxanne Quinby, and she had a vision to create a new national park unit in Maine, adjacent to Baxter. And it was roundly opposed by many, many members of this rural community that had built their history on forestry. And her son did what he said, drank 1,000 cups of coffee. Anybody that was opposed to this usually found Lucas knocking on their door and sitting down and having a cup of coffee to talk about what their concerns are and how this action might actually help them. And in my own personal experience, I worked in rural Idaho at Craters of the Moon. I worked in the bush of Alaska. And there is a deep wellspring of conservation advocacy in these communities, and it's often untapped or completely ignored by the traditional conservation community. So this engagement of rural communities is, I think, absolutely important. We also need to engage communities of color, urban communities that, frankly, often have no access to and deep inequities in the availability of green spaces. And they, too, must be engaged with respect and with empathy and with solutions to the problems that they are facing as well. The Trust for Public Land, which has been around a long time, and for much of its history, it was focused predominantly on purchase of lands for wilderness character or protection in national parks or wildlife refuges as alike. And they made a major shift in recent years to focus more intently on providing parks to urban communities. And that includes things like playgrounds and basketball courts, but also pieces of nature at the same time, often finding vacant lots or old, run-down parts of neighborhoods and converting them into parks for the people as well. We also must expand the recognition and sharing of the American story. There are many segments of our American society that are sort of left out of that story. And we write specifically about this in the book. I'll just read you a little section here. Every aspect of American history has more than one story, more than one perspective. The Americas were not discovered by Columbus, as there were millions of pre-1492 inhabitants with elaborate language, art, architecture, music, religion, and trade. Westward expansion ultimately connected the West, mid-continent, and East Coast into a continent-scale country, but decimated the existing nations of Native Americans. The Emancipation Proclamation granted freedom to 4 million African Americans, but they still had to fight for another 100 years to achieve legally protected civil rights. Hispanic heroes fought in the Civil War, suffragettes chained themselves to the White House fence, and Japanese Americans fought bravely in World War II, even as their families were incarcerated in camps back home. So to address that issue, we took that on while I was in the Park Service. With strong and often bipartisan community support, President Obama established national monuments representing these untold stories. Cesar Chavez, Harriet Tubman, Pullman, Belmont Paul Women's Equality, Fort Monroe, First State, Honouliuli, Charles Young Buffalo Soldiers, Stonewall, Bears Ears, Reconstruction Era, Freedom Riders, and Birmingham Civil Rights. These sites contribute to a more complete story of America, and by placing them alongside the Lincoln Memorial, Gettysburg National Military Park, and the Grand Canyon, help engage citizens who may feel distanced from the traditional and narrower American narrative. We also, in the spirit of Emily's List, which encourages and supports Democratic women to run for elected office, we encourage conservationists, that's you, to think about running for elected office, and they need to be supported and given the tools to win. We also challenge our generation, us old geezers, the conservation veterans who were around for the last 40 or 50 years, to do something that we call an intergenerational transfer of power and responsibility to the emerging younger conservation leaders, for it is really their or your future at stake. And this is one of the missions that both Gary and I are doing this in our continued work. You need to remember that in many cases, major changes in this nation was led by young people. Congressman John Lewis was only 25 when he walked across the Edmund Pettus Bridge over 50 years ago to achieve voting rights for African Americans. We also call for a much more coordinated landscape approach to conservation. Just this month, a colleague of mine at the UC Berkeley, Dr. Patrick Gonzalez, he published his analysis of climate change to all 417 units of the National Park System, and his report shows that national parks are being disproportionately affected by climate change, in part because there already existed environmental extremes like high Arctic or high mountain or arid areas already, and they're already seeing significant anthropogenic change as well. So we now know that it doesn't matter how big these places are, that they are seeing these kinds of change. And so we need to start thinking and acting and operating at the landscape scale and interconnecting communities, state parks, county parks, regional parks, natural areas, protected private lands, all into some sort of network that provides a much greater resilience into the future as well. And as Gary indicated, and I want to reemphasize that conservation must expand its base. And we call for that to bind together the traditional communities of nature conservation, but also with historic preservation and public health and science and civil rights and social justice and the business sustainability community into a common cause. A good example is recently the outdoor retail industry. That is the ski and the Patagonias and the climbing equipment and the tents and the Colemans and all of that out there that provide all that fun equipment for you. They flexed their economic muscle and pulled out of Salt Lake City, Utah, where they've been holding their retail shows for many, many years, and moved to Colorado as a demonstration of their knowledge and value that their industry is based on the protection of public lands. And they saw that Utah was not stepping up to it. And one of the efforts I also did as the director is we finally convinced the U.S. Government Bureau of Economic Analysis to do a full economic blown study on the value of outdoor recreation. And they just put out their report, you may have seen it. It's $373 billion into the American economy from the outdoor recreation industry. That's more than all of oil and gas and mining combined. I also want to emphasize, and this is an area that I think that here at Indiana you're already ahead of, and Gary complimented you and suggested you stay on that course, and that is the linkage between public health and nature. I was just at a conference in Wyoming called the SHIFT Conference, and it was a gathering of doctors, medical professionals, medical researchers, and conservationists to meet for several days and talk about the role nature plays in public health. And there was really a common theme here. You have the medical professionals and the public health officials that want the American public to be healthy, and they are seeing nature as a tool for that. And then you have the conservation community that wants to broaden and base the conservation foundation. And these two communities coming together can be extraordinarily powerful to do just that as well. And as you probably know, there are already a number and a growing number of doctors that are prescribing the outdoors within their practice for issues from obesity to depression. So this is really not the time for the conservation community to to stick in the silos of the past or to quibble over amongst each other for funding or media attention or membership or more. You know, we acknowledge very broadly that there are challenges, and we titled our last chapter Resilience, because we know, we've been doing this for a long time, that a determined and unified movement will not only navigate through this rough water, but make significant and sustained advances. Just another little section from the book. We have faith in and admiration for what the next generation of conservationists can and will accomplish. They inherit a world fraught with peril and a nation divided, but their inheritance also includes access to global knowledge, commitment to improving their communities, and self-awareness that they can and should empower themselves. Finally, we are optimistic because we have seen the firsthand the restorative powers of nature. If provided the opportunity, and sometimes assisted by human insight and skill, nature can recover and flourish. We have seen high meadows in the flanks of Mount Rainier return from bare ground to an eruption of alpine flowers. We have seen flows of water critical to what Marjorie Stoneman Douglas called the river of grass be replenished in the Everglades of Florida. And salmon once again swim the Elwha River from sea to the mountains in Olympic National Park. We have seen community gardens bursting with vegetables in formerly vacant lots of Chicago and Baltimore, and the renewal of beaches and tropical forests on the island of Vieques, Puerto Rico, that was once strafed, bombed, cratered, and littered with munitions. And it is not just nature that can recover and flourish, so can our history, our sense of justice, and our respect for civil rights. So, as Gary said, ultimately we believe conservation is an act of patriotism. And a unified conservation movement that remembers that value and acts with strategic intent to embrace these values will be ultimately successful. And we ground that belief in the resilience of our national values, institutions, and the American people. And as Gary said, we've been taking this on the road with our own strategic intent, is to really build a national dialogue about the future of conservation. And because we believe it is vested in a younger, more innovative and creative leadership. And that's why we've been visiting universities in particular to address college campuses and students that are working in these fields. And we've really enjoyed that opportunity to hear back from students and have been extraordinarily inspired for that as well. So we've been listening. The book ends with just a big story, a story that both Gary and I were actively involved in that demonstrates many of these components throughout the book. It's a very specific story about a conservation effort in Point Reyes National Seashore, the restoration of Drake's Estero in Point Reyes. And this was a long-standing oyster farm in an estuary that had been there for a very, very long time and was having all kinds of impacts to the park. And it had every possible element that, as you go through your careers, you'll have. There were paid lobbyists bent on the politics of personal destruction of me and other employees. There was divided gateway community. We had conservationists pitted against sustainable farming. We had good science that was attacked by other scientists. We had court battles all the way to the Supreme Court. There were multiple investigations, and there was good old-fashioned bare-knuckle politics in Washington from the floor of the Senate to the White House. But through strategic intention, hard work, good science, a lot of great people, we won that battle. Conservation won, nature won. And the oyster farm is gone, along with 3 million pounds of debris that was left behind and removed from the only marine wilderness on the Pacific coast. So one last little reading here. In 2016, the year of the centennial and the election, On one of the low sandbars of Drake's Estero, a harbor seal hauled out with her pup. For the first time in almost 100 years, a harbor seal sunned undisturbed by the motorboats run by oyster farmers. She does not know why it's so quiet, but we do. Thank you.
Let's see, I got to make sure I'm plugged in here. I just want to say thank you to both Gary and John, Dr. Machlis, Director Jarvis, for provocative and thoughtful comments, as well as a provocative and thoughtful and inspirational book that I've read a few times. I've also forced others to read, and I will continue to do so. What we want to do is really in the spirit of what John was talking about is continue that conversation and open it up to questions. What we have is a couple of microphones on either side, and I also, if I can open this computer, have some questions that have been submitted by students here at Indiana University. And what you'll want to do is if you've got a question, you can sort of line up on either side, and or I guess the microphones can move through the crowd. So let us know if you have a question, and let's see if I might be able to open up with a question from one of the students at IU to get things going. And this is a light one, a really light one from Hannah Brown.
I'll take that then.
Okay, great. The idea is quite clear in the book and in the recent past that conservation has been dealt a stunning blow in the last 2 years, if not before. Do you think that we have the potential to reinstate prior conservation regulations as well as new ones, or should we consider those that have been rescinded, like Director's Order 100, the National Park Service, the policy guidance on resource stewardship of the 21st century, should we consider them out of the picture?
I'll take that. Yes, there has been, I would say, you're right in terms of an assault on a lot of these regulations and policies. On one hand, you know, once these kinds of concepts like DO 100, which was the director's order that I put out working with Gary and a number of park professionals and scientists around how we're going to manage and adapt to climate change, while that was technically rescinded, you know, it's out there. And people have it, and you can still Google it, and you can find it, and people are still operating in light of these recommendations about how we are to manage parks and public lands in light of the new stressors. On the regulatory side, one thing that I'm sure all of you that work in government understand is that to actually write and finalize a regulation that is then becomes official on the books is a very, very long process. And often when a new administration comes in, they say, well, they put these in place in the last minute. Well, yeah, they were working on them for 5 years, and they got them done right at the end, but that was, and it also takes about that much time to dismantle them as well. If you don't, then you go to court and you are in violation of the Administrative Procedures Act. And so a lot of these regulations, they say they have rescinded, but what they're actually doing is they're in the process of rescinding them. And unless they do follow all the legal procedures in terms of public awareness and NEPA compliance and the like, they won't succeed in all of that. I do think that while they're busy over there doing that bad stuff, we need to continue to move ahead. And I think that what is sad, but the reality is that the federal government at the moment is not going to lead in these efforts and probably be somewhat of a reluctant partner. So that means that the states, the mayors, the county officials, the the Natural Areas Association and the NGOs, they have to lead at this moment. And once you learn how to lead and take the rope, you're gonna accomplish great things.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. Do you have anything to add to that, Gary?
Nope, all good.
Okay. Questions from the audience? We got one over here.
Yeah, this is for either one of you who would like to answer it. I've been involved in the environmental and conservation movement since the 1970 Earth Day. And one of the things I remember about that Earth Day was that it was very political. There were politicians doing teach-ins. There were people demonstrating in Washington and getting national coverage about it. Given that you're saying that conservationists are patriots and that clean air and clean water are part of the pursuit of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and given that we have a president who seems to have made it a thing to go after our movement, to gain his support, do either of you feel that, since the 1970s, that the environment and conservation movements have put anywhere close to the amount of effort they should have been putting into politics as they have? I'm not saying to be on one side of the political spectrum. I'm talking about holding incumbents accountable to what they say and do, and also getting behind challengers who have an up-road battle in these contests that are willing to champion environmental causes. Do either one of you think that we are anywhere close to being as involved in politics as a constituency as we need to be?
Go for it,
Yes.
Gary.
Yes, we are. Politics in America is a messy democratic business, and it rises and falls in the public consciousness. The attitudes toward environmental politics rise and fall and change. But there is commonality. There is bipartisan potential for conservation if we focus on sense of place, on common values, and we listen with empathy to those we disagree with. And the fact that the national discourse is divisive, profane, and obscene does not mean the full discourse taking place at the county level, at a city planning meeting, mirrors that divisiveness. So I believe that we are an active part, and politics is an honorable part of the conservation movement. I would say to the young persons here, what are the two most important things you can do to be a conservationist? And they are not recycle your cardboard or compost the vegetables from your dorm. The two most important things to be a conservationist are to vote and bring someone else to vote. And if you do that, if John and I had our way, instead of our book being sold in the back, there'd be a voter registration desk.
Hopefully
you
you
wouldn't
in
need
Indiana
it.
by a week.
Yeah.
Right. And so I guess before I turn it over to John, we're actually hopeful. We believe, and John has mentioned it, that for too long the conservation movement has supported politicians who we kind of hope that they're going to support our position of conservation. And they might be Democrats, they might be Republicans or independents, Green Party, libertarians, but we kind of hope they'll back us up. It has fallen on deaf ears. Instead, in the future, we see a role for conservationists to run for office as conservationists, to declare that that is their intention, and to gain the skills to run and win. As John said, we think an Emily's List should be built for conservation young people to run for office. And hopefully, somewhere in this audience is someone under 30 saying, I'm going to run. And maybe you don't run for Senate or governor. Maybe you start with the planning commission. But conservationists need to be there, and that needs to be young people. Take two ideas to heart. The youngest signatories of the Declaration of Independence were 23 years old. Were 23 years old. And the Parkland students, the high school students who suffered through the tragedy of Parkland, are teaching all of America how young people can be engaged, and the conservation movement can learn from it.
Yeah, I'll just add two comments to your question. One is that I actually do think that our generation, the conservation community, made a bit of a tactical political mistake in part of it. And part of it was that we sort of had an attitude that we were protecting these places from the public, not for the public. And in the world's community, the world area of parks, the term protected area is not really considered the right term, because it sounds like we're protecting it from the public. And if you look at the materials that were produced for many, many years, the Wilderness Society catalogs, they never had any people in those pictures, right? They were lonely, and then the environmental communities fought each other about who's the purest and who can protect the most, and it was all about wilderness and wild places, which I'm not saying, I love wilderness and wild places, but it was not protecting these places for the people. And that's where the other side has won the argument, because they've won the argument that we're doing this for jobs, for economy, and somehow being able to pigeonhole conservation as something that is against for jobs or for the economy. And I think we've got to change that narrative, and the only way you're going to change that narrative is to build a much broader base that these places provide so much more than just a place to go on vacation, that they provide resources for public health, they are climate mitigators, they cool cities, they create a social fabric, they reduce crime. There are all kinds of factors that we can build, and they create jobs, sustainable jobs. You can't export the jobs around the outdoor retail industry here in this nation. And one more factor, and this is my own personal experience, and Gary's spot on. It used to be you could go to Congress, you could go into a new member of Congress, and it could be regardless of they're Democrat or Republican, and kind of make your case about national parks or some aspect of conservation. And that's really not the case anymore. They're in there to do one specific thing, and they don't want to hear from anybody else about it. And so the advocacy groups, who have been the sort of, the law arm of the political conservation movement, are really become extraordinarily ineffective in Washington. They can't even get a meeting with a member of Congress. They're lucky to be able to talk to the receptionist. And as a consequence, that voice has really stopped. And so the real game is out here. It's in the communities. It's in the rural America. That's where the conservation community needs to be working if you're going to build that up into the future.
Thank you. Thank you. Here's another question from a student that I think for a while it was following what these gentlemen were saying, and now it's off in another direction, but I'll give it a shot anyway. I think it speaks to the relationship between politics and the people, between young people and older folks, and on and on and on. It says, with the classes that are taught in college about environmental dangers, I feel as though we're being desensitized as to what's happening around us. Since the millennial generation is such a prominent factor in the book, what's the most effective way to teach this generation about the dangers without desensitizing them?
I often hear that people don't want to hear gloom and doom. That's fine. Skip the doom part, but you better hear the gloom. Alarm, strategy, and action. We quote in the book Prime Minister Tony Blair, who said, outrage is easy. Strategy is hard. Yeah. And so teaching and giving them the skills to be able to deal with that gloom and outrage and injustice in ways that they see success, that's really valuable. And you begin with what they care about. Yeah. If you're working with high school kids in rural Alaska, chances are they care about fishing and hunting. So you begin with that. If they are in Brooklyn, New York, and they have a community garden, you begin with that. The teaching, environmental education and teaching begins local. But I do not subscribe to the argument that this generation isn't willing to hear gloom and doom. They're just the doom part. And we have to sound the alarm. If we do not sound the alarm, we are giving them a great disservice. The young people here, your entire careers, you will be confronted with climate change. Your full careers. And your grandchildren will ask you, where were you and what did you do when this generation didn't do enough? So you have to sound the alarm. You have to.
I would add that, and Gary and I do this back and forth. He's the doom and gloom guy. I'm the optimist. I think that there are lots of really great success stories out there of extraordinary restoration efforts. I mean, I worked on for almost 25 years a project to remove the dams on the Elwha River in Olympic National Park. And today there are salmon spawning 70 miles up this river that hadn't gone up there for 100 years. And it restored the culture of the native community that is there. And we were able to preserve the genetics of the fish. So I think, yes, sound alarm, sound gloom, and then juxtapose that with some success stories that where action has been taken and organizations have been built and good science has been applied, you can actually have an impact on the resource, a positive resource impact. And I think showing that, and so I think sometimes, and I'm new to the academic environment, we don't bring in enough of the field practitioners that are actually have gone out into the field and done some good and come back and tell their story. Well, how have they utilized what they have learned to apply it in the field?
So keep on us, make us honest, and make us do the work that you need us to do. A question from the audience. Got over here.
Hi. With this kind of current divisive politics we have in the country right now, and you guys are talking about building a broader conservation coalition, which I think is a great idea. Do you have any ideas of how we can really bring people from, say, the hook and bullet side of the conservation movement, from people who are bird watching, and we might be pulling different levers in the voting booth, but how we can kind of be sure that those groups find common ground and are working towards some common good?
I'll go first. Very quickly. First, 1,000 cups of coffee. If you're not willing to invest in a controversial, divisive conservation issue, if you're not willing to invest 1,000 cups of coffee, you're going to lose. You won't be able to build that coalition because you have to listen, and with empathy. You have to listen with empathy. Years from now, when everyone says, why did we keep burning coal? Do not blame the coal miners. It's all our fault for trying to keep the lights on and make our marvelous machines keep working. And so 1,000 cups is the first step. The second is they do share sense of place and love of place. A West Virginian coal miner and a West Seattle urbanite both care about the places they live in. And so that is another place to build. Never make the disrespectful and resented argument that somehow the opponent doesn't care about the world like you do, or care about their children like you do. The populist movement is fed on resentment and fear. If you feed it, it will grow. And so it's important to find the common ground in ways that are not fearful, and do not bring resentment. And then lastly, I guess I would say, and this borrows from John because he's absolutely right. Where there is success, and I brought up the Great Lakes Initiative and the Chesapeake Bay Initiative, where there is great success, tout that success. Do you not think it on purpose that the Trump administration wants to eliminate the best examples of industry and environmentalists working together so they can continue to claim they are divided? Use those examples to show, well, here's how it worked here. And you may make some success. Over, like, maybe by 800 cups, you'll start to get
Make sure the bathroom's nearby.
Yes.
I think that your question's a really good one because this is two communities that have fought with each other for a long time, and yet they have really common ground. I mean, the hunting and fishing community needs public lands, and they need access to public lands, and they need healthy public lands. And the conservation community wants to preserve those public lands as well. So the first thing is when you sit down together, find the things that you agree on, not the things that you disagree on. You can deal with the disagree later, but find the things where you can really agree and have some early wins, some early successes. Maybe it's an access point to across a piece of private land to public land that you both want to do, and you want to hike it or mountain bike it, and they want to hunt it, and you can come together and achieve that. There's a great story of a very successful large ecosystem project called the Blackfoot Challenge, which is up in Montana, sort of the Rocky Mountain front south of Glacier and almost down to Yellowstone. And we worked on that for a number of years, and a lot of fascinating organizations that worked on it. And it brought together the hunting and fishing, the ranching, the forest industry, the outdoor rec industry, communities together. And we went up as a group to sort of understand what was going on up there. And every time we said, well, when you got to a problem, how did you work it out? And they said, we went to Trixie's. And I was like, okay, and I heard this over and over again. Finally, I said, okay, you got to tell me, what is Trixie's? Well, it's a dive bar out in the middle of nowhere, with really big, gross hamburgers and cheap beer, and that was common ground. They could all go there, sit around the table, have a beer and a burger on this sort of sloping floor and kind of rattle-trap place, and work it out. Work it out. And today, that sort of crown of the continent, Blackfoot Challenge, is almost completely ecologically sustainable with corridors for grizzly bears and wolves, working sustainable forestry, access for fly fishing, hunters. The Fish and Wildlife Service has been in there helping cattlemen to work with them to protect their cattle from wolves. I mean, and they've figured it out, and that's very inspirational to me that they can figure out how to do this. And I think that's a very powerful coalition. And one more thing to remember: REI. How many people have their REI numbers? There are more REI members than there are members of the National Rifle Association. Okay.
I wanted to add one comment. Trixie's is part of the American approach to democracy. As John was describing them drinking the beers and having hamburger, Franklin, during the Constitutional Convention, when they wouldn't agree, they would retire to a nearby pub until they did agree. Trixie's is linked to the Constitution.
Excellent. No, to beer.
The beer. and Ben Franklin, remember his famous saying, beer, of course, is proof that God loves us.
Right. Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. Here's a question that I think follows this pretty well. But first, let me ask, how many of you have a passport to the national parks that you stamp when you go to different places? Great. How many of you know that there is now a bar where you can sit at and get your passport stamped in one unit of the national park system?
I know what that one is.
That's Stonewall.
Stonewall.
Stonewall National Monument. Stonewall is a bar in New York City where the Stonewall riots that really began the contemporary LGBTQ rights movement. So here's a question, say, you talk about strategic intention in creation of national monuments like Stonewall that focus on the LGBTQ community or also other races beyond Caucasians. To my knowledge, you're a couple of straight white guys. How do we genuinely implement diversity and embrace diversity in parks and programs without overstepping boundaries or pushing what may appear to be our own agenda?
I have plenty, but if you want to go first.
Oh, I'll start. I think that for me, I've always been sort of willing to just sort of go into these communities and sit and listen and find out. I mean, I lived in a native village in Alaska, and I spent a lot of time trying to understand just by hanging around with the native elders what were their concerns. What is it that they really wanted to protect and to preserve? And if I could deliver on that, maybe it wasn't a top priority for me, but it was a top priority for them, and I had the ability politically or the skill set or the funding to actually deliver on that, I would do that. I think building trust into communities that have not been served well in American society is one of those skills that you just have to really work on, and it takes time. These communities trust people, not institutions, and you have to build that trust up personally over time. I was very involved in the establishment of a number of units that tell the story of the confinement of Japanese Americans during World War II, like Manzanar, Minidoka, Tule Lake, Honouliuli, and others. And this was a very, very painful component of American story, and particularly painful to the families that experienced it. And again, building trust within that community that their story would be safe with us, that we would be willing to tell it. And I think the transition also in interpretation in the Park Service, Julia Washburn, who was my Associate Director for Education, said that we've moved from the sage on the stage to the guide on the side. That it's not our job to tell their story. It's our job to provide an opportunity for them to tell their own story. And those stories are going to be painful and hard, sometimes difficult for us to listen to, but extraordinarily important that they're heard. And I think that's, once you start building that experience base to work with communities of color, communities that have been discriminated against, and left out of the American experience, it can be extraordinarily rewarding.
American history is an arc that is continuing. We will continually reinvent what is history and what deserves protection. Jimmy Carter doesn't have a national birthplace, his birth home, because he was the first president born in a labor room at a general hospital in Atlanta, and it's still used as a labor room. For the mercy of the parents, they do not put a plaque that says you're about to give birth in the Jimmy Carter room. We always have to figure out what will, just like we had to figure out as a nation that LGBT deserved and Stonewall created the representation for that group, there will be more in the future. There will be more in the future. One of the saddest times when I saw the failure of it, there were two. One is the Park Service in the 80s lost the struggle with NASA. NASA scrapped the last Mercury gantry for scrap metal. And when we build the historical monument to the final frontier in space, we'll have a reproduction of the Mercury. We won't have the original, which I tried to explain to them patiently. It's like knowing what dock in Portugal Christopher Colon left for the New World and cutting it up for firewood. So we will have, and the other one, of course, is why isn't Graceland part of our national, historic preservation.
He will not let that one go either.
No, he won't, but I will tell you that Gary and I did make a play for Guantanamo, but we didn't get it.
Yes, that's right. Well, think of it. What will we do as a country with Guantanamo? And how do we represent that painful period in our history? And for those of you in the Natural Area Association, this goes to the crux of what we're talking about the unified vision. Your success in protecting natural areas is linked to the success of protecting historic sites. It's all one fabric. Nature and culture separated will do us no good. Does anybody here think bison is just a biological resource? It does not, and it carries on its shaggy back all kinds of cultural meaning and religious value and political controversy. We got to get over the fact that you work on natural areas and historic preservation is something done by someone else. We are hanging together or hanging separately.
Right. Excellent. I think we got some questions from the audience over here.
Yes, I run an off-the-grid singing camp that performs in Yosemite for the past 20 years or so. And I've picked up from the young people there singing that, and I would guess that this might be true of a lot of the people here, that they experience the wilds not with a gun, not with a fishing pole, not with a motorboat, but for a sort of a spiritual nutrition, I guess. In a way, it's taken a form, a mild form or a very strong, lively, tactile form of religion for a lot of people, to get out there and just be in the light and the forest and the randomness of nature. And I was thinking when you were saying how important it is to have science and religion, and you mentioned filmmaking, but what do you think is the role for, let's say, the arts and choral music and singing, which is often looked at in it's a kind of a citified practice in our culture. So what do you think? Do you think there's a place for that?
I not only think there's a place, there's always been a place for the arts in conservation and these protected areas. If it wasn't for Thomas Moran and Albert Bierstadt, we would never have been able to sell the national parks, the painters that painted these extraordinary, very, very large landscape paintings of the West that became sort of the market pieces for Congress to protect places like Yosemite and Yellowstone and others. And, the Park Service has been hosting the Artists in the Parks residents in the park system for many, many decades. And the Grand Canyon Suite, there's just been, we hope that the parks will continue to be inspiration for the arts. We had a whole Arts of Fire component of the Centennial that we're asking artists to perform, to do, to be inspired by these natural places. I do think that there's a very interesting field of study around the sense of awe that we get in these places, and there's a whole unit at Berkeley that's working on this particular thing. Not that we necessarily need to prove it, but it's a very interesting value set that is probably underappreciated in terms of dealing with all kinds of potential public health issues and getting people back into these spaces. I saw a piece just this last week that we as humans can make 40 decisions in one day, okay? And after we've done about 40 decisions, we can't do it anymore. And the opening speaker said, what are the three things that Steve Jobs, Zuckerberg, and one other have in common? They all wear the same clothes every day. They don't waste a decision on what to wear in the morning because they want to save that computing power in their brain for later in the day. Well, the research is showing that the way to restore that power is being in nature, and that sitting in a forest or looking at a stream or a lake, some sort of passive experience can completely restore that mental capacity to make decisions. And you think about that in terms of your own lives and what it means. When I worked in Washington, if I didn't get out of that craziness of DC about every once a week, I was completely bonkers. And there's plenty of nature in and around DC to find, and that's you can do that. But I think this is an area that we absolutely need to not only welcome the arts community, but really partner with the arts community to promote these areas.
The Russians have a saying, art is bread. Art is bread. That was a wise question, but I want to take issue with one thing you'd said. You started and prefaced by saying, well, there's the ones out there with weapons, and then there's the ones that are with the fishing pole, and then there's those that go out for spiritual response. I know fly fishermen who consider their fly fishing a mystical act of faith in God. Right. And so so in terms of empathy, in terms of the empathy and common ground I'm talking about, you never know what's going on in another person's head when they're out in the woods.
Yeah.
And that one of the things we can't do is place them in categories. And I do not mean that you did, but the danger would be to say the person who hikes into the wilderness and sits by themselves is somehow having a more spiritual experience than the man who takes his daughter to hunt for her first deer, and it's not so.
Well, I certainly didn't mean that practice. I'm saying that it's just as valid to be there.
It is.
Absolutely.
Then we agree.
I've hunted and fished and all those things, so
Good.
yeah,
Excellent.
it's not-
I think we've got some more people in the audience that have questions, so let's go there.
When do we get to
We can probably take one or two more questions, and then you can drink and sign
Trixie's?
books.
That's Trixie's back there.
Yeah, that's
you
true.
know?
So
What's your hurry?
Trixie.
Go ahead.
You were talking about climate change. Climate change on the national and local level is being dismissed. Even at the state level, trying to come up with support for our theories about the woods and the like, with good sound scientific method. Our studies are being sent away. That's fake science. Here we've talked a lot about science at the Natural Areas Conference. You guys seem to be strong supporters of science. How do you deal with the concept of fake science?
Oh, you can start.
The argument of what is fake is a diversion. Whenever you read the word fake news, fake science, fake means feared. I'm afraid of that science. I don't want to hear that science. But I think the scientific community has made strategic error by trying to be the spokespersons for their own research. In other words, what would have happened to the climate change debate if instead of the scientists being on the front line warning about it, they provided that information to the military generals who understand that it is a national security issue, to the insurance companies who understand it is an economic issue, to the farmers who understand it is an agricultural issue, and that the local mayors, the farmers, the military generals, and the insurance agencies were the ones testifying before Congress using this scientific information rather than the scientists, because then it sounds like special pleading. Listen to us and give us more money for research. That's not going to work. So I believe that scientists need to become better communicators of climate science, but communicate to messengers that can break through that fake argument.
Yeah, I agree. I think that it is a very disturbing time that, science itself is being challenged, and part of that is the general American public not really understanding science, because frankly the scientists have been inarticulate about that, how they derive. I think scientists also probably overqualify their results and say, you know, these are the limitations, and they should say they're limitations, but sometimes they go a little bit too far to the point that, you know, you can't, you can't be using this because it's not applicable. I think the other thing about the media, too, that has not served science well either, that, and I've worked with, you know, I've been on just about every imaginable sort of media, over 60 Minutes and NPR and all the others, and there's a significant problem going on in the media right now, if you haven't noticed, but one of them is that if you have an issue, whatever that issue is, they don't, and let's say that issue has opinions that run from 1 to 10 on the two extreme ends. They don't want to talk to anybody at 5. Right. They want to talk to the 1 or 2 and then the 9 or 10. And it doesn't matter if there's 100,000 people at the 9 and 10 and there's 2 at the 1 and 2. They'll present it as equal. They'll present it as 2 differing opinions, even though the vast majority, like climate scientists and across the world, they'll still find somebody that will argue against it, and that is what's being fed to the public out there as well, and picked up on by extractive industries that are opposed to any regulation around carbon or CO2, and around politicians that get money from those organizations as well to stay in office and to suppress the regulations as well. So we do need a generation of communicators, of science communicators, and the good news is that you now have license. You can blog, you can post, you can create film, you can do, I mean, we have all these extraordinary ways to reach the public, and occasionally it'll go viral and really have that kind of impact that we hope for.
Excellent. We just have a few more minutes before we want to...
May I speak, please?
Pardon?
I'd like to speak.
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
The reason I'm speaking is because there's been no female voice all afternoon. It seemed like it'd be important to just have one.
Good.
In addition, I'd like to thank you very, very much for a remarkable presentation and a remarkable book, and you make us hopeful despite the gloom. So thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And I appreciate both. I appreciate both calling out the fact that we're all male up here, and some of the student questions have been female, but also the call to hope. And I was going to ask each of you just a last question. Gary and John met with some students at lunch, and the question that was first posed was, what's the most interesting project you're working on? And I'm going to ask each of you gentlemen, what's the most hopeful thing you're either working on or you've experienced recently in regard to conservation in America?
I try to figure something hopeful.
You have to end on me because I'm the hopeful guy.
Yeah, that's right. I'm working, now that this book is finished, I'm working on another book about sustainability for the forgotten, for those around the world that have been ignored. The oppressed, the poorest of the poor, the enslaved. Yes, we still have slavery around the world. Victims of natural disasters, and the politically oppressed. And you would think that that book is a very gloom and doom book, but it is inspired by a Catholic priest who wrote in 1962, when he was 26 years old, a fascinating book about his experience preaching the gospel to northeast Brazil, the poorest of the poor. And I understand that this time in our country and around the world, the Catholic Church, and I'm Jewish, so I have no real stake in the game, that the Catholic Church is under great challenge and that the priesthood is under great challenge. But to read this inspiring book, and I've run up the price on Amazon for this used book from 60 cents to about $1.98 now, because I buy them as I see them. To be inspired by a priest who was 26 in 1962 working in Brazil to write my own version of how we deal with the forgotten, that is probably one of the more hopeful things that I have experienced in a very, very long time. The only other one is both John and I are grandparents, and you cannot have grandchildren and not be hopeful.
Yes.
They make you hopeful.
I will. I mentioned a little bit of this in my talk, but I'll give you a little more of elaboration. In 2016, we were in the throes of the centennial, and I was invited to a conference gatherings, not unlike this, that was your typical, not very diverse, predominantly male-dominated conference. And back in the corner of the room was a small group of young, diverse conservation youth. And I was getting an award for inspiring the next generation. That was the title of the conference. And so I got my little plaque, and I'm standing back there in the drink area. And this young woman comes up to me, and she says, "Director Jarvis," she said, "my generation," she was a millennial, she said, "my generation really appreciates what you're doing to inspire us. But what are you doing to empower those of us who are already inspired?" And then she leaned in really close and she said, "You need to let go."
And that is why this is our farewell tour.
She said, "Your generation is hanging on to the leadership of the conservation movement." And she said, "We don't want you to walk away. We want you to facilitate an intergenerational handoff of power." And that's what's been inspiring me ever since that moment, just a few years ago, every day, is to facilitate this intergenerational handoff power to this much younger, innovative, and extraordinary generation that gives me great hope.
Great. One.
Right. Yeah, but
Still
he's pickled.
So I think that's a perfect opportunity to retreat to Trixie's, have a drink, buy a book if you feel moved to, and get a signature. And thanks very much, Director Jarvis, Dr. Machlis.